The summer heat of 1952 pressed down on Millbrook, Texas like a heavy blanket soaked in sweat and secrets. The small town, nestled between cotton fields and dust roads, moved at the slow rhythm of church bells and gossip whispered over backyard fences. Everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. Margaret Sullivan stood behind the counter of Sullivan's General Store, wiping down the same spot she had cleaned 3 times already. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. At 23, she had the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their words and women narrow their eyes. Thick auburn hair pinned back in victory rolls, green eyes that seemed to hold storms, and a smile she rarely showed anymore. The bell above the door chimed, and Sheriff Dale Hutchinson walked in, his boots leaving small clouds of dust on the wooden floor. He was a big man, not just in size but in presence, the kind who filled a room just by entering it. His badge caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he said, tipping his hat with practiced courtesy. "Sheriff," she replied, her voice polite but distant. "What can I get you today?" "Just some tobacco and a Coca-Cola," he said, leaning against the counter with an ease that suggested he owned the place. "Hot enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk out there." Margaret retrieved the items without comment, her movements precise and efficient. She had learned long ago that the less she said to Dale Hutchinson, the better. There was something about the way he looked at her that made her skin crawl, something predatory hiding behind his good old boy charm. "How's your mama doing?" he asked, counting out coins. "She's fine," Margaret answered shortly. "And that brother of yours? Still working at the mill?" "Yes." Dale studied her for a moment, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "You know, Margaret, you don't talk much. A pretty girl like you should smile more. Makes folks wonder what you're hiding." "I'm not hiding anything, Sheriff," she said, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that belied the anxiety rising in her chest. He chuckled, pocketing his change. "Course not. Just making conversation. You have yourself a nice day now." After he left, Margaret gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. She had been careful, so careful, but men like Dale Hutchinson had a way of sensing weakness, of smelling fear like hounds on a trail. The truth was, Margaret was hiding something, something that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, listening to her mother's soft snoring through the thin walls. Something that made her jump at sudden noises and avoid looking at certain people in town. 3 months earlier, on a suffocating June night, Margaret had witnessed something she was never supposed to see. She had been walking home late from closing the store, taking the shortcut through the alley behind the Baptist church, when she heard voices, angry and sharp, cutting through the humid darkness. She had pressed herself against the brick wall, her heart hammering, as 2 figures struggled in the shadows near the church parking lot. One was unmistakably Sheriff Hutchinson, his bulk and voice impossible to mistake. The other was smaller, desperate. "Please," the other person had begged. "I won't tell anyone, I swear." "Too late for that," Dale had growled. Then came the sound Margaret would never forget, a sharp crack that echoed in the narrow space, followed by a heavy thud as someone, hit the ground. Margaret had clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. She watched, frozen in terror, as Dale Hutchinson dragged the body to his patrol car, looked around quickly, and drove away into the night. She had run home, her chest burning, and locked herself in her room. She hadn't slept that night, or properly since. The next day, she heard that Billy Thompson, a young Negro man who worked at the colored school, had gone missing. People whispered that he had probably run off, gotten himself into trouble somewhere else, the way colored folks sometimes did. But Margaret knew. She knew Billy Thompson hadn't run anywhere. She knew he was dead, killed by the man sworn to protect the town. And she knew that if Dale Hutchinson ever suspected she had seen what happened, she would be next. Now, 2 months later, Margaret lived in a state of constant vigilance. She avoided being alone, varied her routes home, and kept a small knife hidden in her apron pocket. She had considered telling someone, but who would believe her word against the sheriff's? This was Texas in 1952. Dale Hutchinson was white, respected, powerful. She was just a shop girl. That evening, As Margaret locked up the store, she noticed a car parked across the street, engine idling. Her stomach dropped. It was Dale's patrol car. He rolled down the window, his arm draped casually over the door. Need a ride home, Margaret? It's getting dark. No, thank you, Sheriff. I like the walk. I insist, he said, and it wasn't a request. Margaret's mind raced. Refusing again would only make him more suspicious. She forced a smile and walked to the car, every instinct screaming at her to run. The drive should have taken 5 minutes. Dale took 15, driving slowly through quiet streets, making small talk that felt like a cat playing with a mouse. You seem nervous lately, Margaret, he observed. Everything all right? Just tired. She lied. You know, people in this town talk, he continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. They notice things, like who's where, and when, and what they might have seen. Margaret's blood turned to ice. He knew, or at least suspected. When he finally pulled up to her house, he turned to face her fully. I like you, Margaret. You're a good girl. Smart. I'd hate for anything bad to happen to you. Sometimes, people see things that ain't their business, and they get ideas about talking. That's dangerous. You understand what I'm saying? She nodded, unable to find her voice. Good girl, he said, reaching over to pat her hand. She flinched involuntarily. Sweet dreams now. Margaret practically ran into the house, locking the door behind her. Her mother looked up from her knitting, concerned. You all right, honey? You're white as a sheet. I'm fine, Mama. Just need to lie down. But Margaret wasn't fine. She was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. If she stayed silent, she was complicit in murder, haunted forever by Billy Thompson's desperate pleas. If she spoke up, she would almost certainly die. That night, lying in bed, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't go to the local authorities. They were all Dale's friends. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. She had heard there were FBI agents who handled cases of corruption, civil rights violations. It was a long shot, dangerous even, but it might be her only chance. The next morning, Margaret told her mother she needed to visit her aunt in Houston for a few days. Instead, she took the bus to San Antonio, where she knew there was a federal building. Her hands shook as she walked through the imposing doors, asking quietly for someone who handled serious crimes. She was directed to a small office where a young agent named Thomas Brennan listened to her story with increasing intensity. He was different from the men in Millbrook, serious, professional, with kind eyes that actually seemed to see her as a person, not just a pretty face or a potential problem. This is very serious, Miss Sullivan, he said when she finished. If what you're saying is true, Sheriff Hutchinson has committed murder and is now threatening a witness. But I have to be honest with you, this will be dangerous. Cases like this, especially in small towns, especially involving, he paused delicately, race relations, they're complicated. I know, Margaret whispered, but I can't live like this. And Billy Thompson, he deserves justice. Agent Brennan studied her for a long moment. All right, I'll need you to make an official statement. And then, Miss Sullivan, you're going to need to go back home and act like nothing happened. Can you do that? Margaret thought about Dale Hutchinson's cold eyes, his veiled threats, the weight of the secret crushing her chest. Yes, she said firmly, I can do that. What Margaret didn't know, as she signed her statement that day in San Antonio, was that her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would take 73 years to fully unfold, that would outlive her, outlive Dale Hutchinson, and eventually shake the very foundations of Millbrook, Texas. The weeks following Margaret's trip to San Antonio were the longest of her life. She returned to Millbrook and resumed her routine at the general store, smiling at customers, restocking shelves, pretending her world wasn't balanced on a knife's edge. Agent Brennan had told her someone would be in touch, that the investigation would take time, that she needed to be patient and careful. But patience was a luxury when you were being hunted. Dale Hutchinson's presence became more frequent, more oppressive. He stopped by the store almost daily now, always with some excuse, always watching her with those calculating eyes. Margaret felt like a rabbit caught in a snare, waiting for the jaws to snap shut. One afternoon in late September, as golden light slanted through the store windows, the bell chimed and a stranger walked in. He was tall, thin, wearing a suit too heavy for the Texas heat, with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous energy that immediately set him apart from the locals. "Good afternoon," he said, his accent marking him as a northerner. "I'm looking for some aspirin and perhaps directions to the boarding house?" Margaret's heart skipped. She recognized the code phrase Agent Brennan had given her, the mention of aspirin when he clearly didn't need it. "The boarding house is 2 streets over," she said carefully, playing her part. "Mrs. Henderson runs it. Clean rooms, good food." "Much obliged," he replied, selecting a bottle of aspirin and some other random items. "Say, you wouldn't know anything about the history of this town, would you?" "I'm a writer, doing research on small Texas communities." "Can't say I do," Margaret answered, aware that old Mrs. Peterson was browsing the fabric section within earshot. "Mostly just farming and church socials around here." The man, who she assumed was another federal agent, nodded and paid for his items. As she counted his change, he slipped a small folded note beneath a dollar bill. "Thank you kindly," he said, tipping his hat and leaving. Margaret waited until Mrs. Peterson had made her purchase and left before unfolding the note. It contained just 3 words and a time: cemetery, midnight, tonight. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. Margaret closed the store at 6, helped her mother prepare supper, and tried to act normal even as anxiety twisted her stomach into knots. At 11:30, she waited until her mother was asleep, then carefully climbed out her bedroom window, something she hadn't done since she was 16, sneaking out to meet boys. The Millbrook Cemetery sat on a small hill at the edge of town, surrounded by ancient oak trees that rustled in the night breeze. Margaret picked her way between headstones, her small flashlight barely piercing the darkness, until she saw a figure waiting near the old Confederate memorial. "Miss Sullivan," the man from the store whispered. "I'm Agent James Whitmore. We don't have much time." "What's happening?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. "It's been weeks. We've been building a case," Whitmore explained, his face grave in the moonlight. "But there's a problem. We need evidence, physical evidence. Your testimony alone, especially given the circumstances, it's not enough. We need a body." Margaret felt sick. "Billy Thompson's body. You want me to help you find it?" "We have reason to believe Sheriff Hutchinson buried Thompson somewhere in the county. We've been watching him, monitoring his movements, but he's clever. However, there's something else." Whitmore hesitated. "We've discovered that Billy Thompson might not have been his first victim." "What do you mean?" "In 1948, a young Negro woman named Clara Davis disappeared from Millbrook. She had accused a white man of assault. The case was closed, ruled a runaway. Then in 1950, a Mexican farm worker named Roberto Alvarez vanished after getting into a dispute over wages with a local landowner. Also ruled a runaway." Margaret's legs felt weak. 3 people? At least 3. And Sheriff Hutchinson was involved in all the investigations. "We think he's been cleaning up problems for the white establishment in this town for years. You witnessed him finally getting careless." "This is bigger than I thought," Margaret whispered. "Much bigger," Whitmore agreed. "And much more dangerous for you. Dale Hutchinson has friends in high places, local politicians, businessmen, even some state officials. If he suspects we're closing in, he'll act. We need to move carefully, but we also need to move fast. What do you need me to do?" "Keep your eyes and ears open. If you hear anything, see anything unusual, you contact me." Whitmore handed her a phone number written on a slip of paper. "There's a payphone at the gas station on Highway 90. Use that, never your home phone. And Miss Sullivan," he added, his voice dropping lower, "if Sheriff Hutchinson approaches you again, if you feel you're in immediate danger, you run. Don't hesitate, don't try to be brave, you just run." The next day, Margaret's world began to crumble in earnest. She was organizing the stockroom when she heard raised voices in the store. Peering through the doorway, she saw Dale Hutchinson confronting a young black teenager named Samuel, who did odd jobs around town. "I know you've been asking questions about Billy Thompson," Dale growled, his hand on his gun belt. "What's your interest in that?" "He was my cousin," Samuel said quietly, fear evident in his voice but standing his ground nonetheless. "My mama, she wants to know what happened to him. He wouldn't just leave without telling nobody. Your mama needs to stop stirring up trouble." Dale said menacingly. Billy ran off, probably got himself killed in some city doing something stupid. That's what happens to boys who don't know their place. Margaret stepped out from the stockroom, her heart pounding. Sheriff, can I help you with something? Dale turned to her, his expression shifting to false pleasantry. Just having a conversation with young Samuel here. Boy, you get on home now and tell your mama to let sleeping dogs lie. After Samuel hurried out, Dale approached the counter. That boy's mama has been talking to some reporter from Dallas. People putting ideas in simple folks' heads. It's dangerous, Margaret. Makes everyone upset for no reason. Maybe they just want answers, Margaret said before she could stop herself. Dale's eyes narrowed. Careful, Margaret. You're starting to sound like you're on the wrong side of things. I'm not on any side, she said quickly. Just seems sad is all. A boy disappearing. Life's full of sad things, Dale replied coldly. Smart people know when to feel sad and when to mind their own business. Which kind of people are you, Margaret? The smart kind, she managed to say. Good, he said. But his eyes told her he wasn't convinced. That's real good. That evening, as Margaret walked home, she noticed Samuel waiting near the corner, half hidden behind a tree. He looked terrified. Miss Sullivan, he whispered urgently. I need to talk to you. Samuel, you shouldn't be here, Margaret said, glancing around nervously. Please, he begged. I know you saw something. The night Billy disappeared. You were there, weren't you? Margaret's blood ran cold. How did you know that? Billy, he told me that afternoon that he saw something bad. Something involving the sheriff and stolen money from the Negro School Fund. He said he was going to tell someone. That night, he went to meet someone, said he was going to work it out. He never came home. Samuel's eyes filled with tears. And I saw you, Miss Sullivan. I was looking for Billy. I saw you come running out of that alley behind the church, white as a ghost. Margaret felt the world tilting. Someone else knew. Another piece that could bring the whole dangerous house of cards crashing down. Samuel, listen to me very carefully, she said, gripping his arm. You cannot tell anyone about this. Not your mother, not your friends, no one. Do you understand? But you saw what happened to Billy, didn't you? You know he didn't run away. Margaret looked into his young face, seeing the desperate need for truth, for justice, for closure. She made a decision that would haunt her. Yes, she admitted quietly. I saw. And I'm trying to help, but you have to trust me and stay quiet. If Sheriff Hutchinson finds out you know anything, he'll kill you too. Just like he killed Billy. Samuel's face crumpled. I knew it. I knew Billy wouldn't just leave. I'm working with people who can help, Margaret continued. But it takes time. Please, Samuel, for your mother's sake, for your own safety, you have to act like you believe Billy ran away. Can you do that? The boy nodded reluctantly, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. What Margaret didn't see as she comforted Samuel in the growing darkness was the patrol car parked 3 blocks away, engine off, and Dale Hutchinson sitting behind the wheel with a pair of binoculars, watching every moment of their conversation with cold, calculating fury. The trap was closing. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Samuel over and over. She had been careless, emotional, and now another person was in danger because of her. The weight of it pressed down on her chest like a stone. At dawn, she rose and dressed for work, moving through her morning routine like a ghost. Her mother noticed her pale face and trembling hands. Margaret, honey, you're not well. Maybe you should stay home today. Can't, Mama. The store needs me. The store will survive one day, her mother insisted, placing a cool hand on Margaret's forehead. You're burning up with worry about something. What's going on? Nothing, Mama. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine, and she wouldn't be fine for a very long time. When Margaret arrived at the store, she found Samuel's mother, Ruth, waiting outside. The older woman's face was etched with fear and grief. Miss Margaret, Ruth said quietly, her voice breaking. Have you seen my Samuel? He didn't come home last night. The world seemed to stop spinning. Margaret's vision blurred at the edges. What? No, when did you last see him? Yesterday evening. He said he was going to talk to someone about Billy, and then he just never came home. Ruth clutched Margaret's arm. Please, if you know anything, anything at all. Margaret felt the words rising in her throat, the truth desperate to come out, but she swallowed them down. If she admitted what she knew, she would be signing her own death warrant and possibly ensuring Samuel's body would never be found. I haven't seen him, Mrs. Ruth. I'm sorry. Ruth's face crumpled. First my nephew, now my boy. What kind of evil is in this town? After Ruth left, Margaret stumbled into the store and locked herself in the back office. Her hands shaking, she dug out the phone number Agent Whitmore had given her. She needed to get to that payphone, needed to tell them Samuel was missing, needed help before more people died. But as she moved toward the door, it swung open. Dale Hutchinson filled the frame, his bulk blocking the exit. Going somewhere, Margaret? Sheriff, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I was just about to open up. No need to rush, he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. I think it's time we had a real conversation, you and me. Margaret backed toward the desk, her hands sliding toward the drawer where she kept the small knife. I saw you talking to Samuel last night, Dale continued conversationally. Looked like a mighty serious conversation. What were you two discussing? Nothing important. He was just asking about work. Don't lie to me. Dale's voice turned hard as iron. I'm tired of playing games. That boy came asking about Billy Thompson, and now he's gone too. Funny how people who ask too many questions tend to disappear in this town. What did you do to him? Margaret demanded, anger overriding her fear. Dale smiled, a cold, terrible expression. Same thing I'm gonna have to do to you, unless you're smarter than I think you are. Margaret's fingers found the knife handle in the drawer. You see, Margaret, Dale continued, moving closer, you made a mistake. You went to San Antonio 3 weeks ago. Told your mama you were visiting your aunt. But your aunt hasn't seen you in 2 years. I checked. You were gone for exactly 4 hours, enough time to take a bus there and back. Now, what would a good girl like you be doing in San Antonio? Lying to her mama about where she was going. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. He knew. He knew everything. I also know about that fancy man in the suit who came asking about aspirin, Dale went on. Federal agent, I'd wager. You see, Margaret, I've been doing this a long time. I know how to spot trouble before it grows. In that moment, Margaret understood with terrible clarity that she was going to die. Dale Hutchinson was going to kill her, right here in her family's store, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But she could hurt him first. I gave them everything, she said defiantly, gripping the knife tighter. I told them about Billy Thompson. I told them about you murdering him in that alley. And I told them about Clara Davis and Roberto Alvarez. They're building a case against you, Sheriff. You're finished. Dale's face went white, then red with rage. You stupid girl. You've killed yourself and probably your whole family. He moved toward her with shocking speed for a man his size. Margaret pulled the knife from the drawer, but he batted it away easily, sending it clattering across the floor. His hands closed around her throat. The world began to go dark. Margaret clawed at his hands, kicked, struggled, but he was too strong. This was how she would die, she thought distantly, murdered by the man sworn to protect her. Just another disappeared person in a town that looked the other way. Then, through the roaring in her ears, she heard a sound that changed everything. FBI, don't move. Dale's hands loosened slightly. The office door burst open, and Agent Whitmore stood there with his gun drawn. Another agent behind him. Step away from her, Hutchinson. Now. Dale released Margaret, who collapsed to the floor, gasping and coughing. But instead of surrendering, Dale reached for his own gun. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Dale drew his weapon. Whitmore fired. The gunshot was deafening in the small space. Dale Hutchinson staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his gun falling from his hand. Within seconds, the office was full of federal agents. Margaret watched, dazed and trembling, as they handcuffed Dale and read him his rights. One agent, a woman, knelt beside her. Miss Sullivan, you're safe now. We've got him. Samuel, Margaret croaked. He took Samuel. We know, the woman said gently. We've been surveilling Hutchinson for the past week. We saw him take the boy. We're searching for him now. Is he? Margaret couldn't finish the question. We don't know yet, the agent admitted. But we're doing everything we can. As they helped Margaret to her feet, she looked at Dale Hutchinson, now wounded and in handcuffs, his face twisted with hatred and defeat. You can't prove anything, he spat. It's your word against mine. And no jury in Texas is going to believe a hysterical woman and some federal agents over a decorated sheriff. Agent Whitmore smiled grimly. That's where you're wrong, Sheriff. We've spent the last 3 weeks digging into every case you ever handled. We found inconsistencies, covered up evidence, and witness statements that were never filed. And this morning, we found Roberto Alvarez's body buried on your property. Would you like to explain how that got there? Dale's face went ashen. If you're watching this story and hoping justice finally catches up to evil, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Margaret's fight for the truth is far from over, and what happens next will change everything. Over the following hours, as the sun climbed higher over Millbrook and news of the sheriff's arrest spread through town like wildfire, more pieces fell into place. A search of Dale's property revealed not just Roberto's remains, but evidence pointing to 2 other burial sites. Samuel was found alive, locked in an old storm cellar on an abandoned farm Dale owned, dehydrated and terrified but unharmed. Margaret gave her full statement, her throat bruised and aching, her voice hoarse but determined. She told them everything she had witnessed, everything she had feared, everything she had endured in silence. Agent Whitmore sat across from her in the federal building in San Antonio, where they had transported her for safety. Miss Sullivan, you're the bravest person I've ever met, he said quietly. Without you, Dale Hutchinson would still be out there, still killing with impunity. I just did what was right, Margaret whispered, though I don't feel very brave. Bravery isn't about not being afraid, Whitmore replied. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. You saved Samuel's life. You brought justice for Billy Thompson and the others. That matters. What happens now? Margaret asked. Now we build the case. It's going to be a long process, probably years. And it's going to be hard, Margaret. There are people in Millbrook who won't like what you've done, who'll see you as a troublemaker rather than a hero. I know, she said softly, but I can't go back there. Can I? Whitmore shook his head. We'll help you relocate, start fresh somewhere new. You and your mother, if she wants to come. Margaret thought of her small town, the only home she had ever known, now forever tainted by blood and secrets. What about the trial? She asked. You'll have to testify, but we'll protect you, I promise. What Margaret didn't know, sitting in that sterile federal office in 1952, was that Dale Hutchinson's trial would indeed take years, that it would become a landmark case in federal oversight of local law enforcement, that it would help pave the way for civil rights investigations in the years to come. She didn't know that her testimony would be sealed for decades, that the full truth of what happened in Millbrook would remain hidden, buried in classified files and fading memories. And she certainly didn't know that 73 years later, in 2025, a cold case detective would reopen those files and discover something that would shake everything she thought she knew about that terrible summer. Margaret Sullivan became Margaret Chen in 1954, marrying a quiet Chinese-American architect named David Chun in San Francisco, 3,000 miles from the Texas dust and secrets. The federal government had helped her start over, given her a new identity, a new life. Her mother had chosen to stay in Texas with relatives, unable to leave the only world she knew, but she understood why Margaret had to go. The trial had been a circus. It dragged on for 18 months, with delays and appeals and courtroom theatrics that made Margaret sick to her stomach. She testified 3 times, each time recounting that horrible night in the alley, Dale Hutchinson's cold eyes, his hands around her throat. The defense attorneys tried to paint her as unstable, vengeful, a woman scorned who had fabricated an elaborate fantasy. But the bodies told the truth that words couldn't. Roberto Alvarez, buried on Dale's property. Clara Davis, found in a dried-up well on county land. Billy Thompson, discovered in a shallow grave near the railroad tracks. The forensic evidence was undeniable. In the end, Dale Hutchinson was convicted on 3 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He was executed in Huntsville in 1956, still proclaiming his innocence, still claiming Margaret had lied about everything. Margaret tried to forget, tried to build a new life in California with David. They had 2 children, ran a small bookstore in the Sunset District, attended PTA meetings and neighborhood barbecues. She became someone else, someone without a past, someone who didn't wake up screaming in the night. But the past never really lets go. In 1987, Margaret received a letter forwarded through her old attorney. It was from Samuel, now a grown man with children of his own, a professor of African American history at Howard University. He had tracked her down after years of searching. "Dear Miss Sullivan," the letter began. "I hope this letter finds you well and that you don't mind me reaching out after all these years. I wanted you to know that I never forgot what you did for me, for my cousin Billy, for all of us. You gave your whole life up to tell the truth when no one else would. That kind of courage changes the world, even if we don't always see how. I've spent my career studying the civil rights movement, and I've come to understand that what happened in Millbrook was part of a much larger pattern of violence and silence. Your testimony, even though it was sealed, became a blueprint for how federal authorities could intervene in local corruption. You helped save lives you'll never know about. I'm writing because I'm working on a book about unsolved civil rights era murders, and I'd like to include Billy's story, if you'd be willing to talk. I understand if you want to keep your peace, but I thought you should know that you're a hero to a lot of people, including me." Margaret didn't respond to that letter. She couldn't. Opening that door meant letting all the ghosts back in, and she had worked too hard to keep them buried. David died in 2003, and Margaret found herself alone with her memories. Her children lived their own lives, busy with careers and families. She volunteered at the library, tended her garden, and tried not to think about Texas. But in 2019, at the age of 90, Margaret received another letter. This one was from Detective Lisa Chen, no relation, a cold case investigator with the Texas Rangers. "Mrs. Chen," the letter read, "I'm writing regarding the 1952 murder case of Billy Thompson and others in Millbrook, Texas. New evidence has come to light that requires your attention. I understand this is difficult, but it's urgent that we speak. There may have been another victim, someone we didn't know about, and there may have been another perpetrator, someone who was never caught." Margaret's hands shook as she read those words. Another victim, another perpetrator. After all these years, it wasn't over. She called the number on the letter. "Detective Chun, this is Margaret Chen. I got your letter. Mrs. Chun, thank you for calling. I know this must be shocking. Can you tell me, in 1952, did you ever hear the name Jonathan Price?" Margaret searched her memory. The name stirred something, but she couldn't quite grasp it. "I don't think so. Who was he?" "He was Dale Hutchinson's deputy. He left Millbrook right after Hutchinson's arrest, moved to Oklahoma, lived a quiet life. He died last year, and his daughter was going through his things. She found a box hidden in his attic, full of photographs, personal effects, and what appears to be a confession. A confession to what? To helping Dale Hutchinson murder at least 6 more people between 1945 and 1952. People who were never reported missing because they were migrants, drifters, people no one was looking for. Mrs. Chun, your testimony helped convict one monster, but there was a second one, and he got away." Margaret felt the room spin. All these years, she had thought justice had been served, that the nightmare had ended. But it had just been sleeping. "There's more," Detective Chun continued. "Jonathan Price's confession mentions you specifically. He says that on the night you witnessed Billy Thompson's murder, he was there too. He was the one who actually pulled the trigger. Dale Hutchinson was covering for him, taking the body to hide it. Price says he's haunted by the fact that an innocent woman sacrificed everything because 2 guilty men couldn't get their story straight about who did what." Margaret couldn't breathe. The memory came flooding back with horrible clarity. There had been 2 figures in that alley, not just Dale. She had been so focused on the sheriff that she hadn't registered the other man, hadn't seen his face. "Why are you telling me this now?" Margaret asked. "They're both dead. What difference does it make?" "Because there's one person who might still be alive," Detective Chun said gently. "Price's confession mentions a woman named Annie Foster. He says she witnessed one of the murders in 1950 and that Dale threatened to kill her family if she talked. She left town, and no one heard from her again. We think she might have been living under an assumed identity just like you. We'd like to find her. Let her know she's safe now, that the men who terrorized her are gone. And you want my help, Margaret said. Yes, ma'am. You're the only living witness to what really happened in Millbrook. Your testimony could help us locate Annie Foster and give closure to 6 more families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the life she had built, the peace she had found, the carefully constructed walls around her past. Then she thought about Billy Thompson begging for his life in a dark alley, about Samuel's terrified face, about all the people who had disappeared into silence. When do you need me in Texas? She asked. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in Millbrook for the first time in 67 years. The town had changed and not changed. The general store was now an antique shop. The Baptist church had been renovated. But the streets still had the same names, and the cemetery on the hill still held the same ghosts. Detective Chun was younger than Margaret expected, in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a determined set to her jaw. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Chun. I know this can't be easy. It isn't, Margaret admitted. But I'm here. They spent 3 days going through Jonathan Price's confession, cross-referencing his details with old case files and missing person reports. Margaret corroborated what she could, filled in gaps where her memory allowed. On the 3rd day, they found something that changed everything. Hidden in Price's papers was a photograph dated June 1952, taken the day before Billy Thompson's murder. It showed Dale Hutchinson, Jonathan Price, and 3 other men standing in front of the Millbrook courthouse. Margaret recognized 2 of them immediately, Mayor Richard Thornton and Judge Harold Westbrook, both of whom had vouched for Dale's character during the trial. The 3rd man she didn't know, but Detective Chun did. That's Marcus Webb, Chun said quietly. He was a state senator very powerful in Texas politics. He died in 1985. Why would Price have this photo? Margaret asked. Look at the back. Margaret turned it over. Written in faded ink were 5 words. The Brotherhood protects its own. Detective Chun pulled out another document, this one a ledger showing payments from various Millbrook businesses to an account registered to M. Webb. We think there was a whole network, Chun explained. Dale Hutchinson and Jonathan Price were just the enforcers. They were being paid to eliminate problems, people who threaten the power structure. Billy Thompson found out about the embezzlement from the Negro School Fund because it was part of a larger scheme. The Brotherhood wasn't just about murder, it was about control, maintaining white supremacy and economic dominance through fear. How many people were involved? Margaret asked, horrified. We don't know yet. But this photo, combined with Price's confession, opens up dozens of cold cases. Your testimony might help us finally expose the whole network. But they're all dead, Margaret protested. What's the point? Their children aren't, Chun replied. Their grandchildren aren't. There are people in Millbrook right now living on wealth built from stolen land, murdered witnesses, and systematic oppression. They deserve to know the truth. The families of the victims deserve to know what happened. Margaret looked out the window of the hotel room at the Texas sky, vast and unforgiving. What do you need me to do? I need you to testify again, Chun said. Not in a trial this time. There's no one left to prosecute. But in front of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're working with the state to create a formal record, to acknowledge what happened, to start the process of making amends. And Annie Foster? We found her, Chun said with a small smile. She's been living in Oregon under the name Ann Patterson. She's 89 years old. When we told her that the men who threatened her were dead and that you were coming forward, she cried. She wants to meet you. 2 weeks later, Margaret sat in a conference room in Austin, facing a panel of investigators, historians, and civil rights advocates. Beside her sat Annie Foster, frail and white-haired but with fierce eyes that reminded Margaret of her younger self. Together, they told their stories. They named names, described horrors, bore witness to a darkness that had been hidden for 7 decades. When it was over, Annie reached for Margaret's hand. We survived, she said simply. They tried to silence us, But we survived. Yes, Margaret replied, squeezing back. We did. The Truth and Reconciliation hearings lasted for 6 months. Margaret testified 4 times, each session broadcast on local news, each word she spoke echoing through a town that had spent 70 years pretending nothing had happened. The reaction was swift and polarized. Some people in Millbrook called her a hero, finally giving voice to the victims who had been erased from history. Others called her a traitor, dredging up old pain for no good reason, tarnishing the reputations of men who couldn't defend themselves. Margaret didn't care about either label. She had spent enough of her life worrying about what people thought. The commission's investigation expanded far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Jonathan Price's confession was just the beginning. Researchers combed through decades of county records, court documents, property transfers, and newspaper archives. What they uncovered was staggering. The Brotherhood, as Price had called it, had operated in some form from the 1920s through the 1960s. It wasn't a formal organization with meetings and bylaws, but rather a loose network of powerful white men who used violence and intimidation to maintain control. Dale Hutchinson and Jonathan Price were their tools, the men who made problems disappear. The commission identified at least 19 probable murders, though they suspected there were many more. Billy Thompson, Clara Davis, Roberto Alvarez, and 16 others whose names were finally spoken aloud, whose lives were finally acknowledged. Most heartbreaking were the stories that emerged from the community. Elderly black residents came forward with memories they had buried for decades. A woman named Josephine Miller, 94 years old, testified that her father had been beaten nearly to death by Dale Hutchinson in 1947 for trying to register to vote. He had survived but never spoke again, living the last 15 years of his life in silence. A man named Carlos Mendez described watching his uncle disappear in 1951 after demanding fair wages from a white farm owner. The family had been told the uncle went back to Mexico. Now they knew he was buried in an unmarked grave on county land. Samuel, now 75 years old, came to testify. He had become a distinguished scholar, but he broke down weeping as he described the night he was taken, the hours he spent in that storm cellar believing he would die like his cousin Billy. When he finished, he walked over to Margaret and embraced her. "You saved my life," he said simply. "Everything I've done, every student I've taught, every book I've written, it's all because you were brave enough to speak up." Margaret held him tightly, both of them crying, 2 survivors bound by trauma and survival. The commission also uncovered the financial networks that had sustained the Brotherhood. Marcus Webb, the state senator, had funneled state funds to Millbrook businesses in exchange for kickbacks. When workers, usually black or Latino, protested unfair treatment or tried to organize, they were dealt with. The Negro School Fund that Billy Thompson had discovered wasn't just being embezzled. It was being systematically drained to enrich white businessmen while black children attended crumbling schools with outdated books. Judge Harold Westbrook, who had been so sympathetic to Dale Hutchinson during the trial, had received regular payments from the Brotherhood. His rulings had consistently favored white plaintiffs in disputes with minorities, had dismissed complaints of abuse, had ruled countless cases as runaways or accidents that were clearly murders. The ledgers told a story of systematic oppression backed by violence. By the time the commission released its final report, it ran to over 800 pages. The findings were devastating and undeniable. The state of Texas issued a formal apology to the families of the victims. The governor stood at a podium in Millbrook and acknowledged that the government had failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens, that justice had been perverted, that silence had been complicity. It wasn't enough, nothing could ever be enough, but it was something. Reparations were discussed, debated, and eventually implemented. The families of confirmed victims received financial compensation. A memorial was erected in Millbrook's town square, listing the names of all 19 identified victims. The old Confederate monument was removed and placed in a museum with appropriate historical context. The Negro school that Billy Thompson had died trying to protect was renovated and turned into a civil rights education center. It was named the Billy Thompson Center for Justice, and Samuel gave the dedication speech. Not everyone in Millbrook was pleased. Some families whose ancestors had been named in the report as Brotherhood members protested. They claimed their grandfathers and great-grandfathers were being unfairly maligned, that the evidence was circumstantial, that everyone was just trying to rewrite history to fit a modern narrative. Margaret received hate mail, anonymous letters calling her a liar, a troublemaker, a bitter old woman seeking attention. Someone spray-painted traitor on the memorial shortly after it was unveiled. But there were other letters too. Letters from descendants of the victims, thanking her for giving their ancestors dignity in death that they had been denied in life. Letters from young activists saying she inspired them. Letters from historians saying her testimony was invaluable in understanding this dark chapter of American history. One letter came from an unexpected source. It was from Rebecca Hutchinson, Dale's granddaughter, now in her 50s. Mrs. Chun, the letter began. I don't know if you'll read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you tore it up. My grandfather was a monster, and my family has spent decades trying to pretend otherwise. I was raised on stories of what a good man he was, how he was framed by vindictive people, how he died a martyr. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has forced me to face the reality that my entire family history is built on lies and blood. My grandmother's house, which I inherited, was paid for with money my grandfather received for murdering innocent people. I've been physically sick since learning this. I'm writing because I want you to know that I believe you. I believe every word you said. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what my grandfather put you through, for what he did to all those people, for the pain my family has caused. I'm donating the house and all my grandfather's property to the Billy Thompson Center. It's not enough, nothing could be enough, but it's what I can do. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. Margaret wrote back. It was a short letter, but it said what needed to be said. Thank you for your courage. The sins of our ancestors don't define us, but how we respond to them does. You've chosen honor over comfort, and that takes tremendous strength. Annie Foster and Margaret became close friends in the aftermath of the hearings. They spoke on the phone weekly, visited each other several times a year. They were the only two people who truly understood what the other had been through, the weight of secrets carried for decades, the cost of speaking truth. Annie had her own story of survival. After fleeing Millbrook in 1950, she had hitchhiked to Oregon, found work in a cannery, and built a quiet life. She had married, had children, never told anyone about Texas. But the nightmares never stopped, and the fear never entirely faded. We lost so much, Annie said one afternoon as they sat in Margaret's garden in San Francisco, drinking tea and watching hummingbirds. But we're here, Margaret replied. We survived. And now other people know what happened. The dead finally have names and graves. That matters. It does, Annie agreed. I just wish we hadn't had to wait 70 years. Me too. The commission's work continued beyond the initial hearings. Researchers kept digging, kept finding new connections, new victims. By 2023, the list had grown to 27 confirmed murders and dozens more suspected cases. Margaret traveled back to Texas several more times, each visit easier than the last. The town that had traumatized her no longer held the same power. The ghosts were still there, but they had been acknowledged, honored, given a place in the historical record. She visited the Billy Thompson Center, walked through exhibits detailing the history of the Brotherhood and the civil rights struggles in rural Texas. There was a section dedicated to her testimony, with photographs and excerpts from her statements. Seeing her younger face on the wall, reading her own words about that terrible night, Margaret felt something shift inside her. For 70 years, she had carried shame along with the trauma, a sense that she should have done more, acted faster, been braver. But looking at that exhibit, seeing her story in the context of the broader struggle for justice, she finally understood what Samuel and Annie and so many others had been trying to tell her. She hadn't been weak. She had been extraordinary. In the fall of 2024, Margaret received an invitation to speak at a symposium on civil rights cold cases at the University of Texas. She almost declined, feeling too old and tired for such a public appearance. But her daughter convinced her to go. The auditorium was packed, more than 500 people. Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, young and old, black and white and brown, all there to hear her story. She spoke for 45 minutes, her voice still strong despite her 95 years. She told them about being a young woman in a small Texas town, about witnessing murder, about living in fear, about finding the courage to speak up when silence would have been safer. When she finished, the auditorium erupted in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. People were crying. Margaret was crying too. Afterward, a young black woman approached her, holding a photograph. "Mrs. Chun, my name is Keisha Thompson. Billy Thompson was my great-uncle. I never got to meet him, he died 30 years before I was born. But because of you, I know his story. I know he was brave, that he stood up for what was right, that he didn't just disappear. Thank you for giving my family that gift." Margaret took the photograph. It showed a young Billy Thompson, smiling and full of life, before Dale Hutchinson ended it all. "He deserved so much better," Margaret said softly. "He did," Keisha agreed. "But at least now he's remembered. At least now the truth is known. That's because of you." As Margaret flew back to California that night, looking down at the dark landscape below, she thought about all the years, all the pain, all the secrets. It had been worth it. Every terrifying moment, every sacrifice, every sleepless night. The truth had finally won. October 2025. Margaret Sullivan Chun sat in her favorite chair by the window of her San Francisco apartment, a blanket over her knees despite the mild autumn weather. At 96, she tired easily, but her mind remained sharp, her memories vivid. The morning newspaper lay folded on the side table. The headline read, "Texas Cold Case Breakthrough Leads to 29th Victim Identification." Even now, 73 years after that terrible summer, new truths were still emerging from the darkness. Her granddaughter, Emily, visited that afternoon with her 2 young children. The little ones played with blocks on the living room floor while Emily made tea in the kitchen. "Grandma," Emily called out, "have you seen the news? They identified another victim from Millbrook." "I saw," Margaret replied, watching the children build and knock down towers with delighted shrieks. Emily brought the tea and sat beside her grandmother. "You know, when I was growing up, you never talked about any of this. I didn't even know about Texas until the hearings started 5 years ago. It wasn't something I could talk about," Margaret said softly. "For most of my life, I was trying to forget it ever happened." "But you couldn't forget, could you?" "No," Margaret admitted. "You never really forget trauma. You just learn to live with it." Emily reached for her grandmother's hand. "I'm so proud of you, Grandma. What you did, testifying back then and then again all these years later, that took incredible courage. Or incredible stubbornness," Margaret said with a small smile. "Same thing sometimes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children play. Then Emily asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Grandma, there's a documentary crew that wants to interview you. They're making a film about the Millbrook murders and the Truth Commission. Would you be willing to talk to them?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She had given so many interviews over the past 5 years, told her story so many times. Part of her wanted to rest, to enjoy whatever time she had left without constantly reliving the past. But then she thought about the 29 confirmed victims, and the others who were still unnamed. She thought about the families who had spent decades not knowing what happened to their loved ones. She thought about young people who needed to understand that justice, even delayed, was worth fighting for. "Yes," she said finally, "I'll do it." The documentary crew came the following week. The director was a young woman named Maria Santos, whose own grandfather had been a migrant worker in Texas during the 1950s. "Mrs. Chun, thank you so much for agreeing to this," Maria said as they set up cameras and lights. "Your story is so important, not just as history but as a reminder of what one person can do when they choose courage over silence." "I didn't feel courageous at the time," Margaret said. "I felt terrified." "That's what courage is," Maria replied. "Being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." The interview lasted 3 hours. Margaret told the story from the beginning, the night she witnessed Billy Thompson's murder, the weeks of fear, her trip to San Antonio, Dale Hutchinson's threats, the arrest, the trial, the decades of silence, and finally the decision to testify again in 2019. Why did you come forward again after all those years? Maria asked. Because I realized that silence protects the guilty, not the innocent, Margaret answered. For 70 years, powerful people in Millbrook had relied on victims staying quiet, on witnesses being too afraid to speak up. Every year I stayed silent was another year they won. I couldn't let them win anymore. What do you want people to understand about what happened in Millbrook? Margaret thought carefully before answering. I want them to understand that this wasn't just about a few bad men. It was about a system that allowed those men to operate with impunity. Dale Hutchinson and Jonathan Price pulled the triggers, but they were protected by judges, politicians, businessmen, and ordinary citizens who chose to look the other way. Evil flourishes when good people do nothing. And what do you hope comes from the Truth Commission's work? I hope it prevents this from happening again, Margaret said. I hope it teaches people that silence has consequences, that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And I hope it gives some peace to the families who have waited so long for answers. After the crew packed up and left, Margaret felt exhausted but also lighter somehow. Each time she told the story, it hurt a little less. The memories would never stop being painful, but they no longer had the power to destroy her. That evening, her phone rang. It was Annie Foster calling from Oregon. I saw on the news they found another victim, Annie said. A young woman named Rosa Martinez. She went missing in 1953. After I left, Margaret said quietly. After Dale was already in prison. Jonathan Price was still out there, Annie reminded her. Still cleaning up loose ends for the Brotherhood. Do you ever wonder how many more there were? Margaret asked. How many people disappeared that we'll never know about? All the time, Annie admitted. But we can't save everyone, Margaret. We could only do what we could do. And we did it. We told the truth when it mattered. They talked for another hour, these two elderly women bound by trauma and survival, by the terrible knowledge of what evil men were capable of and the hard-won understanding that speaking truth to power, no matter how late, still mattered. Before they hung up, Annie said something that stayed with Margaret for days afterward. You know what I realized? We didn't just survive. We won. Not completely, not perfectly, but we won. The men who tried to silence us are dead and disgraced. The victims they tried to erase are remembered and honored. The system that protected them has been exposed. That's a victory, Margaret. Don't ever forget that. In November, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Detective Lisa Chun, who had first contacted her about Jonathan Price's confession, came to San Francisco on personal business and stopped by to visit. Mrs. Chun, it's good to see you, the detective said warmly. You look well. I'm still alive, which at my age is an accomplishment, Margaret joked. They sat and talked about the ongoing investigation. The commission had wrapped up its official work, but researchers continued to dig through archives, and occasionally new evidence surfaced. There's something I wanted to tell you in person, Detective Chin said. We found correspondence between Dale Hutchinson and Marcus Webb, the state senator. In one letter dated August 1952, right after you first testified, Hutchinson wrote that he had a problem with a witness but that he would handle it. Webb wrote back telling him to be careful, that federal attention was the last thing the Brotherhood needed. Margaret felt a chill. So they knew even then that the FBI was involved. They knew and they panicked. That's why Hutchinson got sloppy, why he tried to kill you in your own store in broad daylight. He was desperate. And that desperation is what finally brought him down. So my testimony really did make a difference, Margaret said softly. Mrs. Chun, your testimony made all the difference. Without you, Dale Hutchinson would have kept killing, the Brotherhood would have kept operating, and none of these families would have ever known the truth. You changed history. After the detective left, Margaret sat by the window and watched the sun set over San Francisco. She thought about the long, strange journey of her life. From a young woman in a small Texas town to a refugee in California, from silence to testimony, from victim to survivor to witness to, finally, victor. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Samuel. Just heard they're adding Rosa Martinez's name to the memorial. 29 names now. 29 people who won't be forgotten. Thank you for making that possible. Margaret typed back slowly, her arthritic fingers clumsy on the small keyboard. We all made it possible. together. In December, Margaret celebrated her 97th birthday surrounded by family. Her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren filled her apartment with noise and laughter. They sang, ate cake, and told stories. Her youngest great-grandson, just 5 years old, climbed into her lap. "Grandma Margaret," he said seriously, "Mommy says you're a hero." "What's a hero?" Margaret smiled and stroked his soft hair. "A hero is someone who does what's right even when it's hard and scary. Someone who helps people who can't help themselves." "Like Superman?" the boy asked. "A little bit like Superman," Margaret agreed. "But without the cape. Are you a hero?" Margaret thought about Billy Thompson's desperate pleas in that dark alley. She thought about Samuel locked in a storm cellar. She thought about 29 names on a memorial in a Texas town square. People who had been erased but were now remembered. "I tried to be," she said finally. "I tried to be." As 2025 drew to a close, Margaret knew her own time was limited. Her body was failing slowly but inevitably. But her mind was at peace in a way it hadn't been for most of her life. She had lived to see justice, imperfect and incomplete but real. She had seen the truth triumph over lies, seen victims honored and perpetrators exposed. She had seen a small Texas town forced to confront its darkest history and begin, however reluctantly, to make amends. Most importantly, she had proven that one person, even a powerless young woman in a time and place that tried to silence her, could make a difference. That courage mattered. That truth mattered. That speaking up, no matter the cost, was worth it. On New Year's Eve, Margaret sat by her window one last time, watching fireworks explode over the city. She thought about all the years, all the pain, all the fear. And she thought about the memorial in Millbrook with 29 names carved in stone, forever testifying that these lives had mattered, that these deaths would not be forgotten. She had done what she set out to do 73 years ago when she walked into that federal building in San Antonio. She had told the truth, and the truth had set them all free.